Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk About, the show where I ramble on about various video game topics. And today's subject is the story of Dark Souls 3. Now, before I get into the real meat of this subject, because it's going to be quite spoilery, I wanted to touch on a few things. First, I apologize for the lack of big videos in the last few weeks. I have several projects going, and I haven't really had time to work them all out yet. But I will say that my Game Reflections episode of Dark Souls 3 will probably be coming out in the next week or so. And I do have another Black Sheep episode in the pipeline that'll be coming up soon. So don't worry, I got more content on the way. I've just had a lot of stuff going on over the last week or two. I also want to say it took me a bit longer than normal to get through my playthrough of Dark Souls 3 because I wanted to start my first playthrough as a sorcerer. And I know sometimes the magic system in the Souls series is considered by some fans the easy mode. Well, I have to say, in Dark Souls 3, it was definitely not easy for me. Mostly because I missed, there's a sorcery NPC, Orbeck of Vinheim, and I failed to get a certain key item for him in his quest, so he left the hub. And as a result, I didn't have access to the higher level spells in the game, so I was stuck with the low to mid-level range spells for the rest of the game, and I really didn't want to respec my character just because I know I want to try out the magic system, so I was like, I'll just power through it, get through the game, and get to New Game Plus. When I play that character again, I'll have access to the sorceries. So that's why it took me a bit longer. It made some of the fights a whole lot harder. I actually did able to help me out in some of the later game fights just because my character's build wasn't suited to what I was up against. That being said, I still had loads of fun, and I'll cover why I love this game so much in my Game Reflections episode. But now, on to my discussion about the game's story, and I wanted to go more in depth here than I will on my Game Reflections episode, because I generally try to keep those non-spoilery. So, I'll put up a big spoiler warning here for anyone who hasn't completed Dark Souls 3, because I'm about to really talk about some of the stuff that happens, especially in the late game. Now, as many of us know, this is going to be the last game in the Dark Souls series, according to From Software. And I would have to say this definitely shows in just the lore and in many of the game's areas. It definitely feels like the end of the story arc. And even though I took the normal ending, the Link the Fire ending, from what I've heard, the other endings offer a really different take on that, and I'm really anxious to see what those are like. Just because the cycle of the Souls world, the Age of Dark and Age of Fire, I know when back in the original Dark Souls 1, I thought if you sided with the Age of Dark, it was just a total jerk move. But as the series has gone on, it's really interesting how much of a gray area the whole Soul series delves into, because it's in some ways, especially at this point in the series, it seems the only choice to make, the only real choice to make for the whole world is to end the cycle, because it's just a cycle of death and decay that just keeps going and going. And while there's little sparks of life, as they say, the fire always eventually fades, and only dark will remain. And I always thought, what I loved about the Scholar of the First Sin expansion for Dark Souls 2 was Aldia found a way to outside of the cycle. He didn't find a way to break it, so to speak, but he found a way outside of it. And I always thought that was really fascinating, and it showed that there was a way to stop this horrible thing that just kept happening to the world, even if it wasn't a beautiful choice in of itself. So I'm anxious to see if one of the endings of Dark Souls 3 expands on what happens to Lord Aldia in Dark Souls 2, because that storyline always really fascinated me. And I will say I loved going back to the earlier areas in the series and seeing how they've changed so much. My jaw dropped once I found out I was in Anor Londo. I was like, I can't believe they put this back in the game. And then the fight with Lord Aldia, who's devouring Dark Sun Gwendolyn, it was just a real wow moment for me as a fan of the series, and I loved all the lore implications there. And I guess that makes Dark Sun Gwendolyn's death in the first game non-canon, because he's obviously still alive. And the same thing with Crossbreed Priscilla, because he uses some of her attacks in that fight as well. I also found it fascinating, the whole Lords of Cinder idea, that there's all these powerful beings who were supposed to link the fire, but ultimately abandoned their duty. It's something that I don't entirely blame them for, just because as someone who's played all the previous stories in the series, I can totally see where some of them are coming from, and that they just don't want to continue this cycle of life and rebirth and death and decay and all that fun stuff goes with the Age of Fire and Dark. Although I will say, Aldrich is a total jerk, so I did not feel sorry for Lord Aldrich of the Deep there. He had that coming. Of all the Lords of Cinder, aside from Ludleth, who helps you get boss soul weapons, which is always nice, I thought Yorm the Giant was the most noble, I guess. After reading some of his lore, it seemed like he really wasn't such a bad guy, and he felt disappointed in himself, and he just couldn't face his duties as a Lord of Cinder anymore, and that's why he abandoned that role. And as for Prince Lothric, he kind of takes the stance of abandoning the flame from like the first games, and just he doesn't think that reigniting the Age of Fire is the thing to do. And in some ways I agree with him, but as the player, you have to get all the Lords of Cinder to decide for yourself what to do with the linking the fire. And I will say, I absolutely loved the last boss. I think it's absolutely hysterical how From Software totally pulled the wool over their eyes, and they had the final boss character in all the promotional art, in the box art, and I even a little Funko Pop figure of the guy. I was completely unaware that this guy was going to be the final boss, so I thought that was very cool. But what was even better was during the second phase of his fight, finding out that he had Lord Gwyn's moveset. I think that's just so fantastic that From Software made the final boss like an amalgamation of all the characters who have linked the fire before. They have all the different popular builds from the Souls games as far as player characters go. And then in the second phase you have to fight the original person who linked the fire, Lord Gwyn. And it just made for a fantastic ending to the game, even though I had the Link the Fire ending, which, as I said, it might not be the strongest ending of all the ones available. It still was a very satisfying conclusion to the series. And I realize that there is more DLC content on the way, but as with the previous games in the series, the DLC doesn't really change the ending per se, I guess with the exception of Scholar of the First Sin, but regardless, usually it just adds on more bits to the lore and more backstory and stuff. That's what happened with Artorias of the Abyss in the first game, and then the 3 crowns in Dark Souls 2. We learned more about the struggles of the world against just all the horrible things that were happening in it, like the Abyss, and all the Daughters of the Abyss in Dark Souls 2. So as I said, I don't think the DLC will change the way the game ends to a great extent, and I'm perfectly okay with that, because I think this is a very solid ending for the Dark Souls 3 story, and I truly hope that the story ends here. I mean, I would love to see similar Souls-like games in the future, and I think that's why they did Bloodborne, is that way they do have another series to continue off of if they want to do that playstyle again. But the story of Dark Souls 3, at this point, there's not much more you could do with it. And that's why I think ending the cycle would probably be the strongest ending, even if it is a bit of a downer, just because it seems like the best course of action for this particular world, because hopelessness, it's not completely devoid of hope, and that's why I do like Dark Souls. It's very much a gloomy setting for sure, and very few smiles to grow around, but it's not completely devoid of hope. And in some ways, not to sound too morbid, but ending the cycle of that's been going on in the Soul story kind of is a relief, just for all the characters in the world, and just the world of Dark Souls in general. Just letting it go to rest and not having to worry about living and dying again, just having an end. And that's why I think it's a good, solid ending for the series, because you can't really go anywhere else with it. I think I covered all the main bits of the story I wanted to cover. I've been trying to discover all the NPC side stories as much as possible. I know I missed a whole bunch in my first playthrough, especially with the sorcerer, as I said. So I'll be really excited to try to go through those. I know Anri of Astora and Yol of Londor have this really important storyline called the Lord of Hollows, which I haven't discovered for myself yet, but I'm really anxious to get through it and see what happens. But so I'll have, as I said, I'll have tons of fun exploring all those various storylines, but the main core story of Dark Souls 3 is what I really enjoyed about this game, and I'm very happy with the way it turned out. So I want to definitely give a hats off to all the people at From Software for doing such a fantastic job with the series. I've loved each and every entry into this franchise, and I'm so glad I've discovered it, is because it's quickly become one of my favorite gaming experiences ever I've ever played. I just love the gameplay, the story. It's all fantastic. And as I said, I'll go over all the aspects of Dark Souls 3 in more depth in my Game Reflections episode in a little bit. But I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on the Dark Souls 3 story. And sorry if this ramble was particularly long. I was very passionate about the story of this game, and I just wanted to share my thoughts on it. So, thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on the Dark Souls 3 story. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and feel free to share your own thoughts on the story in the comments below. And if you're feeling particularly awesome and want to see more Dark Souls and other video game content in the future, please subscribe. I hope you enjoy my channel. I have a lot of fun working on it. And so until next time, keep having great adventures, everyone!